Man of Steel, the latest reboot of the Warner Brothers superhero franchise, has many new things, including British star Henry Cavill in the lead role. But one element it has carried over from the 1978 original film is the casting of a major Hollywood figure in the part of Jor-El, Superman's father from the planet Krypton. In '78, we got Marlon Brando. Here we have Russell Crowe, who gets a good deal more screen time than Brando did, plus the chance to ride on a giant cicada. I think that's what it is at the beginning there. This decision on the part of screenwriter David S. Goyer, director Zack Snyder, and producer Christopher Nolan may have backfired, however. In considering the box office slide the picture took in its second week of release, the LA Times' Betsy Sharkey wondered if the emphasis on Jor-El may be part of the reason. As she wrote, the film turns to Jor-El for historical context, and Superman comes with a lot of historical baggage. Apparently, the filmmakers believe they have a lot of explaining to do. I think Sharkey is onto something. At least that was a large part of my resistance to the picture. And it's not just Jor-El. Man of Steel is loaded with all sorts of unnecessary backstory and Krypton minutia. Did this bother you too, Michael? And better yet, let me ask you the question that I started my written review of Man of Steel with. Does any movie really need a world engine, a phantom drive, and a Genesis chamber? Little much. Come on, it's a little much.
You're talking about a trilogy's worth of expository hoo-ha there, anyway. But I don't know, Josh. I think I was a little reluctant to embrace Sharkey's basic argument in that LA Times commentary that it pins the box office. I don't even really like looking at any box office numbers.
It's hard to read those tea leaves.
Yeah, but I think I don't think audiences are necessarily resisting, if they are, to the degree they are resisting Man of Steel. I don't think they're resisting it because it gets a little thick in some of the expository passages. Because I frankly think some of the, and I'm not such a unrepresentative member of the audience. I think that those scenes where Crowe's Jor-El has to do this sort of visual PowerPoint presentation that has actually some very interesting computer graphics in this sort of like Russian constructivist silvery black and white style that kind of gives you the whole history.
They gussy it up quite a bit. I'll give you that.
To me, it was actually some of the more interesting filmmaking in the director Zack Snyder's picture, but I think there's a simpler explanation to why people aren't really telling their friends, "Hey, go see it," or they're seeing it maybe a second time themselves. I think that last hour is a chore.
Yeah.
It's a chore, and this is the section of the film. It's roughly a 2.5 hour picture. This is the section of the film where they're turning most of that hour over to two immensely long battle sequences that grind on and on and on. And when you get a response from an audience of sheer exhaustion and enough already from both of those fight sequences, you have people kind of walking out like they've been kind of run over by a steamroller. And that's what I felt. That's what I sensed.
For me, yeah, it's probably a double whammy because I didn't care for the first part of this film or that final section that you're talking about. The final section is really just a lot of punching, and it gets to a very specific problem with the character of Superman is that he is invincible. So you punch him, it doesn't hurt. He punches Zod, it doesn't hurt because Zod has powers on Earth too. And we get a lot of this back and forth where by the time one of them is thrown, I don't even remember which one it is, thrown from the surface of Earth into a satellite in outer space and then just comes back. I mean, there's nothing really for us to be concerned about when they never get hurt. And that's why these action scenes seem to go on and on and on. And the other problem is most of the action is between two computer-generated figures, it seems to me, instead of actors who we get even, that removes us even more. Do you know what I mean? It's not only that they can't get hurt, it's that they're not even people.
There's no what you'd call old-fashioned fight choreography because of this problem you mentioned, the sort of the digital overload. But I think I experienced the fights in a different way than you did, Josh, in that I did. Yes, these characters are essentially impervious to pain, but the level of destruction and really kind of just a hand-to-hand physical violence is kind of grotesque. I mean, in other words, people get thrown through not just one building, but 17 buildings. So that Metropolis by the end, and again, this is conscious by design, looks a lot like New York 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And that's all those echoes, those visual echoes of real pain and destruction are deliberate and they're extremely heavy-handed. And I think they just sit on the damn movie.
You are weak, son of El. Unsure of yourself. The fact that you possess a sense of morality and we do not gives us an evolutionary advantage. And if history has proven anything, it is that evolution always wins.
Do you think spectacle filmmakers in the back of their minds, maybe not consciously, but in the back of their minds feel like they have to compete with 9/11? Somehow it's having something of that scale in reality that now when we go to a movie, they're almost seeing it as competition. How am I going to, I mean, this sounds grossly insensitive, but there have been a number of Hollywood summer films now where we talk about this, how they're reminiscent of 9/11.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is almost this sense of we've got to give something not just to evoke it, but to be bigger or more amazing and capture the audience's attention in a way that that original reality horror did. I just wonder if that's what's happening.
It can be done. I think it's a good question. A lot of this comes back to the director and writer Christopher Nolan, who did the Dark Knight trilogy and who had a story credit on this latest Superman picture, Man of Steel. I think he's at least a writer and a director working on a level of, I guess, arguably moral intelligence, where you can argue with whether or not you like The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Returns, or if you think they went too far. But especially that middle Batman picture, The Dark Knight, I felt like the real world dread and really queasy kind of moral and ethical dilemmas in the middle of all the violence made the picture hold together. And
sure,
I think the stakes felt very high, but without feeling really punishing to the audience. Now, by the third Batman picture, The Dark Knight Returns, and really throughout a lot of Zack Snyder's Superman film, I just felt like enough or too much. And people can evoke 9/11 in all sorts of commercial popcorn ways that don't offend me. Steven Spielberg's, there's a few scenes in War of the Worlds that consciously kind of get at this very ashen-laden, this ashen sky, this urban destruction, and sort of an awful sense of dread and just the scale of the pain and the suffering. And yet it doesn't feel, I don't feel cheap for being excited or kind of like strung along by the
Maybe
suspense.
it's not a crutch as it sometimes feels here to rely on that.
Right. I mean, look, Spielberg's better than Michael Bay in that department. I mean, the Michael Bay Transformers films are full of images.
He's probably
like
better
that.
than him in a few departments.
Yeah,
but that may be one of them.
But now they're business partners. They work together.
I know,
There's
I know.
Spielberg's name on the Transformers
Yes.
series, kind of eroding his own reputation with every billion these movies make. But I think I saw Man of Steel twice, and I didn't really want to, but my son, who's 12, wanted to take a couple of pals, and I thought, well, I'll go again just to kind of see how it plays with an audience. And really, everybody kind of was very mixed on it and did feel just kind of exhausted by that last hour. And I think that's the problem with the movie. I don't think the problem is whatever expository nonsense they get tripped up on at the beginning of the film or the middle. Audiences, Josh, forgive all that nonsense, all expository overloads they put up with in all kinds of films. If it comes before the midpoint of the film, they're willing to overlook it as long as that last hour works.
Audiences might, but I can't. This goes back to a problem I had with a summer film from last year that we actually reviewed together with Adam on the show, Prometheus, which was full of this sort of myth-making and lore and world building and even worse, world explaining. And I just felt like you were exhausted by the end of Man of Steel. I was exhausted by the time the first 40 minutes were over, just from getting all of that. And the problem here, I know that the 78 Superman has that as well. There's a long section at the beginning with Brando.
Yeah, nobody went to that movie for the first 40 minutes. I know. I remember that, yeah.
Maybe that was it. And there, it seemed to have been pretty much dropped once they moved on. Brando does make one reappearance, but here, Crow doesn't go away. And worse than that, Michael Shannon as Zod, he picks up the reins and starts explaining to us about the technology of Krypton and what his plans are and his relationship to the history of Krypton. In a sense, we never leave the planet, even though we get to Earth. And I think that this story's root is Superman's experience on Earth among humans and learning how to live among them and relate to them. That's where we really get a sense. That's where this story at least hooks me. And here I felt like it was almost an alien invasion picture. We got a lot of aliens, very little of his relationship with the people on Earth, and that especially seemed like a misstep because I thought Kevin Costner was fantastic as Superman's adoptive dad.
I do like a lot of the casting in this film, Josh, and I guess that's one of the reasons I think it's not a failure. And even though I liked it, I was mixed the first time. I was actually quite a bit less than mixed by the second time I saw Man of Steel. But I like those scenes in Smallville. I think the casting of Costner, as you say, Diane Lane, very good. And I'd say really, Michael Shannon in the limited scope of that role, bringing his interstellar glare of doom to everything. I think he's quite good. My issue with it, up and down, is whether or not you think the director Zack Snyder can film action in an interesting way. And really, the answer is essentially no. Snyder, to me, is really just sort of a talented lunkhead. In a film like Watchmen, which I found kind of reprehensible, I think he was trying to approximate the stylized level of extreme violence he got in the graphic novel, which is like it or not, a very clever and well written achievement. And I just felt like, in some ways, the violence you get in Man of Steel, yes, it's comic book violence, but he doesn't have the visual imagination to make it make sense in a movie. To me, it just feels like pound, 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 pound.
I'm going to say that Sucker Punch is Snyder's reprehensible film.
Oh, my God.
I actually liked Watchmen. But I think that's a case of the material. I think he did have
much
good
better
material with Watchmen, and that helped quite a bit. You're listening to Filmspotting. This is Josh Larson with the Chicago Tribune's Michael Phillips. Adam Kempenaar is taking the week off. And I do want to go back to the casting that you were talking about, that you pretty much appreciated who they put in this film. The one reason I was really excited about this movie, because I'm not a huge Superman guy, was Michael Shannon as Zod. Terrence Stamp made that original role iconic for this genre, and Shannon seemed like the kind of actor who'd be able to step, as Ledger did. You might think we want to stay away from a villain role that someone had already established as their own. Jack Nicholson did it with the Joker, then Ledger made it really even better, I feel like, in The Dark Knight. So I was excited about seeing what Shannon was going to do, if he was going to be up to the challenge, and I feel like he backed away from it. I mean, this is a guy that I love him in just about everything he does, and he seemed to almost make a conscious decision to underplay Zod in a lot of ways. He does have that glare, that's right, and maybe it's because he just has to give all this exposition that he's undercut by the screenplay, but I didn't think he had much presence at all as Zod. It was a huge disappointment for me.
Not so much for me. I think given the material and the kind of monomaniacal nature of that role, I think Shannon's instincts as an actor, this is a new kind of role for Shannon. He hasn't really taken this sort of outsized role in a huge commercial blockbuster before. And so there may be sort of a little bit of feeling his way toward the right tone or the right pitch, but I really think his attempts to make this a kind of a complicated villain, a guy who's at least got mixed motives for what he's doing, or he's not pure evil like Heath Ledger's Joker. It's not like that. He's got his reasons and his motivations, but I'd really, everything has a chance to go wrong at the movies before you get to the casting stage, as I've said before. And I think, although I kind of like this screenplay structure in that it laces in the flashbacks, and at times you don't really expect them. And that's why the thing has this kind of odd rhythm. I mean, good or bad, it's sort of an unusual structure in that you start at one point in Superman's Earth life, and then you throw him back to his childhood, and then you're forward again and then back. And I actually rather like the structure of it, but in terms of scene to scene and moment to moment, it is unrelievedly humorless and heavy-handed.
There's one joke. I think there's one joke that I saw.
And Zack Snyder as a director, he's not. And then so you add this sort of humorlessness and the very kind of portentous myth making in the script, and then Zack Snyder, who's really just like a sledgehammer behind the camera.
The structure for me was really frustrating, actually, because it felt like we were getting something of an origin story at first, and then we get a prequel in a lot of ways. Then we were getting a sequel. Then we got a reboot. It's almost like, I don't know how many of these they hope to make, probably as many as are profitable, right. But we were getting the first 4 all together here, and it was very chopped up. That didn't work quite as well for me.
You let them handcuff you?
Wouldn't be much of a surrender if I resisted. And if it makes them feel more secure, then.
What's the S stand for?
It's not an S. On my world, it means hope.
Well, here it's an S. How about...
Sir?
I wonder what it says, though, that we've talked about everyone in the cast, I think.
Except Henry Cavill.
Except Henry Cavill. We haven't mentioned Amy Adams either. I don't think there's much to say there. But is that because Cavill is so bad? I kind of have to go back to the screenplay.
No, I don't.
I feel like
he's not bad. He's not bad.
He could be a great Superman. I just don't know yet. And that goes back to the structure for me, too. Because just as we're starting to get his story, I think the first time we see him, he's as this fisherman out at sea. And he's kind of gone off on his own. And we start to get a sense of who he is, what he's facing. And then, as you said, we're back to kindergarten.
Yeah, no, it is odd. It's odd.
It almost undercuts Cavill in a lot of ways. It never allows us to get a sense of his take on the character.
Yeah. No, it starts out like he's in the middle of a Wolverine movie or something. You know what I mean? Like sort of the rugged loner, the rugged shirtless loner who's been to the gym a lot lately, and
it's that seafaring work.
Yes,
Michael.
And he's also very conspicuously and heavy-handedly. It's pointed out that he's 33 years old, which I think.
Oh my goodness!
Wasn't he? That was the age of old JC, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
You're more of a God guy than I am. I think,
that's
Josh,
also in line with the shot of him when he goes to church. I don't know why all of a sudden he feels the need to go to church, and they frame him with a stained glass window of Jesus in the background. I mean, this is just some of the heavy-handedness you get in
some of it
area.
Isn't. I mean, that's the thing about the whole Superman myth anyway. I mean, some of it is, even though there's just as much coming from, I think, the Torah as the Bible in this story. It's an interesting scramble of both, but it goes beyond just being parallels to kind of a Christ-like parable or something like that. It just flat out is what it is, and it's
pandering in a lot of ways is what it is.
But I mean, it's also, I think, Josh, it's why people. You can talk about the box office receipts being disappointing for Man of Steel a little bit. Still, you're talking about several hundred million people going. There's something about the basic building blocks of this story that people do come back to. This idea of this sort of, saintly religious figure from another world who's sort of sent to save humankind. People of all stripes and a lot of different faiths sort of hunger for this in their popular entertainment, and you can argue with the results, but I guess that's why part of the reason people keep coming back to the Superman well.
And I think this movie gets at that the best in those Smallville scenes. I wish there were more of them, or even that they were packed together a little better so they grew in resonance for us rather than just a snippet here or a snippet there.
Good point.
The final scene with Costner, the last time we see him, I think is really effective and also speaks very much to the character of Superman and how he will go on to live his life. But again, we get it just as a little snippet, and then we move on backwards or forwards, and it's pretty disorienting. Superman is out now in wide release. If you see it and agree or disagree with our takes, you can leave us a voicemail, 312-264-0744. You can also find us on Twitter at Filmspotting and at Facebook.com/Filmspotting.
So you heard what we thought of Man of Steel, kind of mixed to negative, I would say, for both of us. Stick around and find out why listeners saw it or avoided it. Plus, Massacre Theater. Stay with us.